He didn't even ask why. The moment I told him I'd been laid off, he looked at me like I was defective, like the very foundation of our marriage had been built not on love or loyalty, but on what I brought to the table. "You should go stay with your sister," he said, folding his arms like a judge handing down a sentence, "until you figure your stuff out." But what he didn't know, what he never bothered to ask, was that I didn't need saving. I didn't need his roof, his rules, or his cold reassurances, because while he was calculating my worth based on a paycheck, I had a fortune waiting in silence, one he never knew about, and one I was finally ready to use, not to take revenge, but to take back my life. We met when I was 32 at a charity auction in a downtown hotel I'd nearly talked myself out of attending. He was polished, confident, and surrounded by people who laughed too hard at his jokes. He had a voice that filled rooms and a smile that always seemed 2 seconds ahead of his next clever remark. I was quieter, focused, independent in a way that made some men uncomfortable, but he didn't seem to mind. In fact, he said he liked that I wasn't just another pretty face with nothing to say. We dated for a year and married the next spring. In the early years, we were a good team, or so I thought. We kept separate accounts but split the big stuff: mortgage, travel, house projects. I worked in corporate marketing. He ran a series of high-end car dealerships his father had passed down. He always made more money, and he never let me forget it. It wasn't cruel, not exactly, just casual reminders. Little comments like, "Well, I could cover it, but your bonus is coming up, right?" Or, "It's nice to have a wife who pulls her weight." And I did. Until the layoffs came. They called it a strategic restructure. Entire departments vanished overnight. I walked out with a cardboard box and a generous severance and a pit in my stomach that wasn't about the job. It was about him. Because I already knew. He wouldn't see the loss as temporary. He'd see it as a weakness, a liability, something shameful. So I told him that evening, gently, before dinner. I said I'd be okay, that I had savings, that I just needed a few weeks to recalibrate. He didn't yell, he wasn't comfortable. He simply put his fork down and said, "Maybe it's best if you take some space." I blinked. "What kind of space?" "Just until you get things sorted," he said, already reaching for his phone, already checking out of the moment. It's not personal. But of course it was. He had no idea that while I'd been building brand campaigns by day, I'd also been quietly investing. He had no idea that I owned 40% of a startup he once laughed at. And he had no idea that when he sent me packing, he was letting go of the most valuable thing in his life. I packed slowly that night, not because I needed time, but because I wanted clarity. With every folded sweater, every zipped bag, I let go of the version of myself that had tried so hard to be enough for him. The one who measured her value by how smoothly the bills were paid or how presentable she looked beside him at galas. He sat in the living room, pretending to scroll through emails. I asked him once, just once, "Are you sure this is what you want?" He didn't look up. "It's not what I want. It's what's practical. You need space, time to figure things out. This isn't personal." But it was deeply personal and quietly final. I left that night with 2 suitcases and the envelope from my severance package. I drove to my sister's guest room where she welcomed me without questions. Just tea and an extra blanket. I didn't cry. I'd already done my grieving inside that house. Years of soft disappointments, backhanded compliments, and the slow, subtle erosion of what a real marriage should feel like. His love had always come with a receipt. But now I have freedom, and I had something else. 3 years ago, I invested in a small wellness tech startup launched by a woman I met at a marketing retreat. She had heart, vision, and a pitch deck that no one was taking seriously. I believed in her. I gave her $60,000, quietly, without fanfare. It was my Money. He never knew. The company took off. At first it was modest. A few clinics, an app, some licensing. But then came the corporate wellness contracts, and then a partnership with a national insurance network. My 40% stake, once seen as a risk, now held value well into 7 figures. I never touched it. I let it grow. I never boasted about it. And I never told him, because deep down, I knew what he'd do with it. He'd find a way to take credit, or worse, claim it was ours. But it wasn't. It was mine. And now, with no job, no house, and no husband pressing expectations onto my shoulders, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't lose security. I gained control. And it was time to decide what to do with it. 2 weeks after I moved in with my sister, the messages started. Not calls, he never liked confrontation, but texts, short and clipped. Let me know when you're ready to talk. Just checking in. How's the job hunt? We should revisit the finances before tax season. Each message was carefully worded to sound supportive, but I knew better. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about his image, about what our friends might think, what our neighbors might assume when they noticed my absence at the next dinner party. He needed to look like the patient husband giving his wife time to heal. He had no idea I'd already healed, or that I was sitting on more financial power than he'd ever imagined. Still, I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I met with a financial planner, a woman, one who didn't flinch when I told her my entire situation. She reviewed my assets, my investments, my startup equity, and said, "You're in a better position than most CEOs I advise." I smiled, but I wasn't surprised. I had built this quietly, with care and calculation. While he was busy performing success, I was creating it. My lawyer, also a woman, also sharp as glass, was next. We reviewed our marriage contract, our shared assets, and what I was legally entitled to, which, ironically, was everything he thought was his. The house, joint ownership, retirement accounts, heavily under my name after years of consistent contributions. His business, he had used marital funds to expand it. That opened a door. But the most poetic detail? The very month he asked me to leave was the same month my startup entered acquisition talks. Within 60 days, my 40% stake would become a windfall, and he didn't know a thing. But that wasn't what stung him in the end. It was the silence. The fact that I didn't beg to come back, that I didn't justify myself, plead my case, or try to prove I was worth keeping. He was used to women, circling around him, orbiting his needs. But I had left his orbit entirely. The day I served him with separation papers, his response wasn't anger. It was confusing. "Why now?" he texted. "Can't we work through this?" I replied simply, "You told me to go." I listened. He didn't write again for days. When he finally did, it was a photo, our wedding picture, the one we kept, above the mantel. "You really want to erase this?" he wrote, and I stared at that image for a long moment before replying, "I'm not erasing anything. I'm building something new." That's when the tone changed. He started calling, asking for meetings. Suddenly, he wanted to talk in person, for closure. I declined, not out of spite, out of peace. Because when someone throws you out, what they're not expecting is that you'll land on your feet. And they never imagine that when you rise, you'll rise higher than you ever did with them. The strange thing about grief is how quietly it changes shape. When he first asked me to leave, I thought the pain would come from absence, from the silence of our home, the routines we built, the idea of us unraveling. But it didn't. What hurt most was the realization that I'd been living a performance for years. I had convinced myself we were partners, that his ambition and mine ran side by side, that our occasional disagreements were normal, that his little dismissals about my job, my opinions, my voice, were just part of the ebb and flow of marriage. But when the ground fell out beneath me, I saw what had always been there. I had built us, and he had stood comfortably atop it. The space I found at my sister's house didn't just give me time, it gave me a mirror. I started asking myself hard questions, the kind that don't come with easy answers. When was the last time he asked me how I felt without looping it back to himself? Why did I always shrink a little before speaking up around his friends? Why did I let him believe that we was real when it always meant him first? These weren't just red flags. They were roots, deep, quiet, tangled roots that I had watered with patience, loyalty, and the exhausting need to keep the peace. It shook me, not because I had loved him, but because I had loved the idea of who I thought he might eventually become if I just held on long enough. Letting go of him meant letting go of the fantasy that he would ever choose me over his ego. And once I did that, everything got lighter. I slept better. I ate slowly. I found joy in the small things again. Brushing my hair in silence, choosing my own coffee mug in the morning, spending an hour reading without glancing at the clock. I began to see how much of my life I'd spent explaining myself, justifying my career, dimming my light so he wouldn't feel overshadowed. And now, without that weight, I was expanding. I also started volunteering at a financial literacy nonprofit. I spoke with young women about quiet wealth, how to invest without needing validation, how to protect your name, your work, your independence. I didn't share my story directly, but pieces of it lived in every word I spoke. One girl asked me, "How do you know when it's time to walk away?" And I said, "When you realize you're not being loved, you're being managed." That landed harder than I meant it to, because that's what he did. He managed me. But now, I was no longer manageable. I was free. The fortune I'd kept, hidden wasn't just in the numbers or the startup deal. It was in my clarity, my strength, my voice. He never saw any of that because he never looked beyond the surface. But I did. And the woman I saw looking back at me now, she was everything he couldn't control, and everything I had waited far too long to become. 3 months after I'd left, I bought my own place. Not a mansion, not some sprawling estate. To prove a point. Just a small, modern home with warm wood floors, tall windows, and enough space to breathe. It had a kitchen I loved, a quiet reading nook in the corner of the living room, and a garden patch in the back where I planted lavender and basil. It was mine, fully mine. Paid in full, no mortgage, no ties, no one else's name on the deed. The day I moved in, my sister brought over a bottle of wine. We sat on the floor surrounded by boxes, eating takeout, and laughing like we were 17 again. "This place feels like you," she said. I smiled. That's the whole point. And it was, because for so long I had shaped myself to fit within someone else's expectations, his preferences, his opinions, his fragile pride. But now every color on the wall, every book on the shelf, every choice reflected me. I didn't tell him about the house. There was no need. He still texted occasionally, polite check-ins wrapped in veiled curiosity. "Hope you're doing okay. Saw something that reminded me of you." I didn't reply, not out of anger, but out of peace. Because I was no longer interested in reopening doors I had locked from the inside. He had shown me what I meant to him when I no longer served a purpose, and no amount of nostalgia would change that truth. What I wanted now wasn't revenge, it was a restoration. And brick by brick, breath by breath, I was building it. That first night in my new home, I stood in the backyard barefoot, looking up at the stars. The wind was soft, the world was quiet, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was, right here, right now, exactly enough. The real escalation didn't come through lawyers or dramatic confrontations. It came through whispers. A mutual friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in months, reached out over coffee. She hesitated, at first stirring her drink slowly before saying, "I think you should know. Michael's been talking." I raised an eyebrow. "About what?" about how you left him, how you had this whole secret financial life behind his back. He's making it sound like you blindsided him, that you were dishonest. I didn't flinch. I'd expected this eventually. Men like him don't sit quietly in discomfort. They rewrite it. Is anyone buying it? I asked. She shrugged. Some are. Most are confused. They only ever saw you as the stable one, the calm one. They can't quite picture you just walking away. That was when it hit me. Not everyone roots for your healing. Some people only understood my silence when it benefited the narrative they liked best. And now that I had found my voice, it unnerved them. He was trying to recast the story, not for legal gain, but for image. Because when a man discards his wife for losing her job, he's heartless. But when a man is abandoned by a woman who was hiding money, he becomes the victim. It was manipulative, and it was calculated. But I didn't take the bait. Instead, I responded the only way I knew how, with grace. I hosted a private dinner at my new home. Just 10 people. Close friends, no announcements, no explanations. I cooked every course from scratch, filled the space with soft light and good music, and gave them nothing to gossip about, just truth they could feel in their bones. After dessert, one of them said, "You seem lighter, like something finally let go." I smiled and said, "That's exactly what happened." I never defended myself against Michael's rumors, because I didn't need to. The people who mattered had been watching for years. They saw who compromised, who gave, who stayed steady when storms came. And now they were watching me rise, not as a rebuttal, but as a reminder that you don't need to scream your worth, you just need to live it. Several months had passed. The sale of my startup shares finalized. Quietly, exactly as I wanted. The lump sum sat safely invested, diversified across portfolios I had been building in secret long before my marriage began to crack. I didn't splurge. I didn't upgrade my life into something showy or loud. I refined it, carefully, intentionally, like seasoning a slow-cooked dish with the patience of someone who knows her worth, doesn't need flash. One morning, while I was organizing receipts for tax season, I got an email with a familiar name. In the subject line. It was from Michael. I stared at it for a long time. The subject read, "A conversation, if you're open to it." It wasn't angry, not groveling either. Just a single clipped sentence inside. "I think I finally understand what I lost. If you'd ever be open to meeting, just to talk, I'd appreciate the chance." He signed it with his full name, not the nickname he used to sign birthday. Cards, not love, M, just Michael. I closed the message. For 3 days, I said nothing. I didn't talk about it with my sister. I didn't reread it. I let it sit in my inbox like a door I had no intention of opening, but still needed to stare at one last time. On the 4th day, I replied. Short, clear. "I appreciate the message, but I've said everything I needed to by how I chose to live after you left me. There's nothing more to talk about. I wish you peace." I hit send and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It wasn't bitter. It was finality. Because somewhere between being kicked out of my own home and building one from scratch, I had stopped needing closure. I had created it. In every choice, every silence, every beautiful, independent moment that didn't require anyone else's validation. Later that week, I passed our old house while visiting a friend nearby. The shutters were a new color, and the hedges trimmed neatly. There was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. For the first time, I felt nothing. Not sadness, not nostalgia, just distance. Like I had driven beyond a chapter I no longer needed to reread. I rolled down my window and let the breeze in, light and cool against my cheek. And then I drove home, to my home, where everything was still in bloom. Peace doesn't always arrive in the way you expect. It doesn't burst through the door or make a grand speech. Sometimes it just slips in one morning, quiet as breath. While you're sipping coffee and reading a book no one recommended, just one you chose for yourself. That's how it happened for me. One day, I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for him to call, not for justice, not even for someone to congratulate me for surviving what I never should have had to endure. I had simply arrived. I started a small consulting agency from home, branding and messaging strategy for women-led businesses. Nothing fancy, just honest work done with purpose. I took on clients carefully, choosing the ones who reminded me of who I once was, determined, underestimated, and done being dismissed. Every woman who came through my door carried some version of my story. Some had been sidelined in boardrooms, others in their own marriages. And with every campaign we built, every product we launched, we stitched a little more strength back into our stories. I also began mentoring 2 young women at the financial literacy nonprofit. Both were in their 20s, both brilliant, both afraid of taking up too much space. I saw myself in them, the early me who always felt she had to apologize for being ambitious, who thought love meant sacrifice and silence. I taught them what I had learned: how to protect your money, your ideas, your name, how to let your work speak without needing to scream, how to walk away from anyone who reduces your worth to convenience. One of them asked me if I'd ever consider writing a book. I smiled. Maybe someday. But for now, I was content writing in my journal, the same one I'd carried since the day I left that house. It held recipes, plans, reflections, and truths I had never said aloud until now. And each time I flipped through those pages, I remembered the woman who had stood in front of her husband after losing her job, thinking she had lost everything, only to discover that she had, in fact, been carrying her future all along, not in secret, but in strength. Sometimes I think about how different things could have been. What if I had told him about the investment early on? What if I'd shared every detail of the startup, invited him into that journey, allowed him to claim a place beside me in that quiet success? Would it have changed anything? I don't think so. Because a man who values you only when you're useful is not a man who can handle your brilliance when it outshines his own. And maybe that was the truth I wasn't ready to face until I lost everything he thought defined me. My job, my place in his home, my role in his version of a marriage. He never loved me for who I was beneath the titles, the productivity, the performance. He loved the idea of being married to a woman who made him look good. But the woman I became without him? She's not here to be looked at. She's here to build, to rise, to choose herself without apology. Letting go of him wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of remembrance, a way to finally return to the girl who once believed she could be anything, before the world asked her to shrink into someone more manageable. I no longer measure love by its longevity. I measure it by its depth, its respect, its willingness to weather the storm with me, not hand me an umbrella and walk the other way. I used to believe that marriage meant merging completely, dissolving, parts of yourself to keep the bond tight. Now I know, any bond that requires your silence is not a bond at all. It's a cage, and I've never been meant for cages. There are moments now, late in the evening, when the house is still, when the candlelight flickers against the page of my open journal, when I feel something close to awe, not at what I survived, but at what I built from the rubble. He tried to define my ending. But I was never his story to finish. And that's the beauty of quiet strength. It doesn't scream when betrayed. It rebuilds, it reclaims, and then it rises, so fully, so freely, that no one dares question its place again. Not even the one who tried to erase it. The last time I saw him was by accident, months later at a bookstore downtown. He looked older somehow, not in years, but in posture. His confidence no longer filled the room. He paused when he saw me, eyes uncertain, like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite decide how. I offered a polite nod. That was all. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to reminisce, but I didn't wait, because that moment wasn't about him. It was about me standing there, calm, self-possessed, holding a book about women in business that I was gifting to a young mentee. I walked away without a second glance, and it felt like walking into sunlight. I didn't need vindication. I didn't need him to see what I had become. Because the real triumph was never in showing him. It was in showing myself what was possible when I stopped asking for space and started claiming it. That day, I went back home, sat on my porch with tea and my journal, and wrote a new phrase in the margin. Your peace is your power. Not your money, not your marriage, not even your success. Your peace. And now I protect it the way I once protected a fragile dream. Except it's no longer fragile. It's rooted, alive, and entirely mine.